Welcome to History 112, Lecture 13, Progressivism and Women. Now, with these barriers in place, only a handful of women managed to enter these professions. From about 1900 to 1960, about 5% of all medical doctors were women, and while there's a constant presence of female doctors, really you're seeing it being a drop in the bucket compared to the overall trend. Now, where things were open was what people at the time regarded as helping professions nurses, social work, teachers, and so on. Now, what is going to happen there too is there's going to be an emphasis on professional standards in those professions, and that's going to require more women to go to college. In the long term, a process begins where this allows an increasing number of women to enter academia, and many women's colleges are going to mainly have female professors, and you start to build up more and more college opportunities for women. It takes a little bit of time to take off, but there's a process there that's ultimately going to lead into the women's movement we're going to talk about later. Now, when we think about the women's movement emerging, we see it kind of pop up here and there and then really take off a bit later on. But this time period, some really important stuff happens. Now, at the beginning of the Progressive Era, women had no voting rights, rarely held public office, few professions were open, and then usually only in female dominant professions, and most men and women thought that women were unsuited to the public world. Now, women are going to play a huge role in the reform movement this time, and we're going to see some major progress there. It's going to be some significant achievements, and these are also going to be things that are going to be built on in later decades. Now, one of the things that allows women to take a much more active role in the progressive movement than they maybe had in previous time periods was this whole idea of a new woman. This was a woman with spare time. Work moved to factories, children were entering school earlier, and most non working women, as a result, had large amounts of spare time. In addition, there were all these new appliances that were coming into the household that were really reducing what was needed. For example, a vacuum cleaner is a very efficient machine compared to what you had to do before, where you had to move all the furniture, roll up the rug, hang it over the railing, and beat it with a stick to literally knock the dirt out of it. So women have more time because these new appliances are making it very simple to do the same work. Now, a lot of college educated women are coming up at this time too. Now, a lot of those educated women are going to reject marriage. Some are going to live alone. Some are going to try to play a larger role in public life. And there's also a phenomenon called Boston marriages, which is a long-term platonic relationship between two women who live together. Now, in addition to that, divorce rates are going to rise dramatically. So you see less women entering into the sort of traditional marriages that had been there, and you see those women who do having an increasing amount of spare time. And this all going to come together and mean that women are going to get more active in things that pique their interest. One of the things that piques women's interest early on is the idea of women's clubs, and they have a rapid growth at the end of the 19th century, and these become an important intellectual outlet for middle and upper class women. And a lot of these clubs start coming together towards the end of the 19th century under the umbrella of the General Federation of Women's Clubs, and the idea initially is that they simply want to coordinate their local activities. In the beginning, these are all about cultural issues. For example, they're raising money for a local theater or something of that nature. But later on, they're going to move into reform issues and take on a whole host of other ideals. Now, in 1892, this General Federation of Women's Clubs only had about 100,000 members. By 1900, it had grown to 160, which is decent growth, but by 1917, we're seeing it increase to about a million members, so we're seeing it grow quite rapidly during the Progressive Era. Now, few clubs, however, are integrated, and a lot of African American women do realize how to start their own clubs, which sometimes had different interests. Now, some of these clubs, especially the ones that cater to a lot of upper class women, have significant financial resources. And since women can't vote at this time, when they do take up an issue, it is really difficult for the politicians to argue that they have some political agenda. So once these clubs start to get active, they bring a lot of power, they bring a lot of influence, and they bring a lot of money to the table, so they're often able to get things done. Now, by and large, these clubs rarely challenge prevailing attitudes about women, and only a handful of their members really endorse feminist ideas. These clubs are really about creating a public space for women to take up their issues rather than challenge conventional gender roles. And most of what they did was really uncontroversial. We're talking about building parks and hospitals, but they really do take on a few key issues, and they get a lot done in those key issues, like workplace conditions for women, or safe food, or urban housing, pensions for widows and abandoned mothers, and they're the only group in society standing up advocating for Native Americans. Now, while women's clubs play an important role, the suffrage movement is also gaining strength during this time, and there's a lot of radical women who start to take on the prevailing ideas of the time, which were that there was a male sphere and a female sphere. Men were supposed to be at work and engage in public life. They were supposed to be the protectors and the providers, whereas women were supposed to be the caregivers and remain at home. So there's a real dynamic between the two, where one group was relegated to a second-class status. This suffrage movement is going to try to take on that second-class status and advocate for gender equality. Now, as that movement is growing, it is going to spawn an anti-suffrage movement that is going to be male-dominated but supported by a number of women. This main argument they're going to put forward is that suffrage and equal rights goes against the natural order of society, as they put it, and they claimed that voting in particular for women would lead to things like divorce, promiscuity, and the neglect of children. So they're using a lot of very emotionally loaded arguments advocating for women being relegated to that second-class status and being denied equal participation in public life. Now, the National Women's Suffrage Association grows from only 13,000 members in 1893 to 2 million by 1917, and they become well organized in their attempts to gain the vote for women. Now, what makes them different is they go ahead and redefine the entire argument. When it became an argument about what role women should play in terms of gender equality, it wasn't getting anywhere. But when they come along, they accept this idea that men and women belong in different spheres of public life, and they argue that women, by virtue of being caregivers, would use politics to better society and help the poor, and that's why they deserve the vote, because they would make sure that people weren't being excluded the way that men had. So they argue the two-sphere system to say that they actually deserve the vote under this system because people are being left out and ignored. They also link themselves to the growing temperance movement, and a lot of supporters of the temperance movement were women, and they argued that women were going to look after issues like that. And this is a whole movement in the country that is pushing to get rid of alcohol. And when these two issues get kind of married together, to get the ban on alcohol passed, they really need to give women the vote to get it done. Now, they're also going to argue that women are more maternal and would check aggressive male impulses to war. And so after World War I, that argument really starts to take on credence, and a lot of factors converge at that time. Now, voting rights during this time period come primarily at the state level, sometimes only in local elections. The first 6 states to give votes to women are going to be in the West, several in the 1880s, and none until 1910. Between 1910, though, and 1919, you're going to see it grow to 39 of 48 states, so it really takes off. And in 1920, when all these factors converge, full voting rights are being given to women at the federal level. Now, there are some feminists at the time who are going to push for an equal rights amendment that would forbid discrimination based on gender, like the 14th Amendment had done for race. It was not widely supported. It was introduced to Congress, though, in 1923, went to the states in 1972, and still needs 3 more states to ratify. And every once in a while, you'll see it in the news that it comes up for a ratification vote in one of those remaining states. So what's the big idea here? Well, women had more free time, and they could use that free time to leverage a lot of political and financial power for certain causes through things like women's clubs. Now, separate from that and gaining strength during this time period is the suffrage movement, and their successes come with the convergence of a change in the argument about reframing it so that votes are seen as a positive good within existing social structures, and also the convergence with the temperance movement and some conditions following World War I. See you in the next lecture.